La emisión está comenzando. Todos los asistentes están en modo de solo escucha.
Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to greet you and to welcome you on behalf of the NBSAP Forum to this second webinar of the Introduction to Resilience for Development MOOC, offered by the United Nations Development Programme. My name is Marcela Torres, and I'm a consultant on sustainable development and green economy. I will be your facilitator throughout the entire course. We are grateful for your participation in the second webinar, titled How Do We Assess Resilience?, which was presented by Paul Ryan of the Australian Resilience Centre in the recording you watched on our YouTube channel. Unfortunately, he will not be joining us for the questions and answers session due to difficulties with the time difference, but we will be honored to be accompanied by Alison Quinlan of the Resilience Alliance. Paul Ryan is director of the Australian Resilience Centre. He divides his time between the Australian Resilience Centre, where he is founding director, and the Stockholm Resilience Centre in Sweden, where he works on a program focusing on new approaches to development. He has run more than 550 days of resilience assessment, training and capacity building, and on-ground implementation with farmers and local communities, government and development agencies. He has worked extensively in regional Australia and more recently in developing countries with communities facing natural disasters, social and economic stresses and shocks. Paul has previously worked for the Resilience Alliance, CSIRO, and state and regional agencies. Alison Quinlan is a senior research fellow with the Resilience Alliance, an international multidisciplinary research organization that explores the dynamics of social-ecological systems. She has played a key role in developing resilience assessment tools and focuses on the practical application of resilience thinking in a variety of contexts. Alison has led resilience assessments in a broad range of systems, including water management in rural Tajikistan, coastal fisheries in Canada, and restoration of the upper Mississippi River in the US. Recent publications focus on trade-offs with measuring resilience, future scenarios, and ecosystem services, and the role of resilience in transforming social-ecological systems. She has participated in dialogues as an Agropolis Foundation Fellow, contributed to the Arctic Resilience Report, and is co-leading the development of Wayfinder, a guide to resilience assessment in the Anthropocene, under the GREAT program at the Stockholm Resilience Centre. The presentation provides an introduction to the concept of social-ecological systems before moving into an overview of resilience assessments and the phases of resilience assessments. It focuses on the three broad phases of resilience assessment introduced in this course: defining and describing the system, assessing system dynamics, and designing interventions based on the results of the assessment. For each phase, the presentation offers practical examples based on experiences in the field. Welcome, Alison, and thank you for accepting this invitation. It's a pleasure to have you here today.
Thank you, Marcela. I'm very happy to be here today, and I'm very happy to be following on Paul Ryan's presentation, How Do We Assess Resilience? I've been working with Paul this past year on Wayfinder project that you mentioned in my bio, and we've had a lot of really interesting discussions very recently about the process of resilience assessment and how we advance that approach. So I'm happy to be here today, and thank you, Marcela.
Thank you, Alison. Before we begin, I would like to remind all of you of some rules and dynamics of the NBSAP Forum webinar sessions. First, Alison will provide us with an overview of Paul's presentation, addressing key themes and ideas and how they apply in her work. Microphones will be muted during Alison's overview. This reduces interferences and facilitates communication. We will then continue with the question and answer session. Please send us in advance your questions or raise your hand in the control panel of the GoToWebinar. If you want to speak and the connection allows it, I will open your microphones during the Q&A session. This session is being recorded and will be available on the NBSAP Forum website, www.nbsapforum.net. All participants will receive an email with a link to watch it, as well as a PDF copy of Paul's presentation. Now I will transfer the webinar to Alison, who will offer some reflections on Paul's presentation. We hope you enjoy this session.
Thank you, Marcela. I wasn't sure if the presentation had already been viewed or if we were going to be viewing it now. And I had looked at it yesterday, and so this is going to be a little bit off the top of my head because I thought we were going to be watching the presentation together right now. I have looked at Paul's presentation, and I think that what he did was a really good overview. He offered a really good overview of the phases of resilience assessment. And I believe I'm sharing my screen right now, and so I'm just going to go through some of the slides as a quick overview. The framing of resilience assessment, Paul emphasized the importance of integrated social-ecological systems, and I would strongly concur with the necessity to approach resilience assessment with a framing of people in place being tightly interconnected and understanding how a social-ecological system behaves as a complex adaptive system with properties such as emergent behavior. The reason that we have this framing is because so many of the problems that we're confronting with a resilience assessment approach are very complex. Normally they deal with multiple interacting issues, a variety of stakeholder groups with different interests and benefiting from the system in different ways. Also bringing to that dialogue multiple framings and knowledge systems. And so by providing this social ecological system framing, it's really critical to bring together that diversity of perspectives and also interact with the processes in the ecosystem and the ways in which those relationships between people and place, landscape or seascape, interact. And so again, the social ecological system framing is a really critical component to resilience assessment approach that Paul emphasized in his talk. Another key component of Paul's presentation that I would like to briefly touch on is the issue of scale and multi-scale. And this comes up again and again in resilience assessments. There is that initial phase that Paul described of defining the boundaries of the system and really identifying in an approximate way the boundaries, because again, this is an iterative process, but with the understanding that there are systems above and also systems nested within that focal system. And these cross-scale interactions, the ways in which larger scale systems can constrain or influence what happens at a focal system. And similarly, how nested subsystems, whether they're households or communities, can really generate novelty and trigger change within that focal system in a positive way. So multiple scale approach to resilience assessment is another key component that I'd like to highlight from Paul's talk. And thirdly, and then I'll open it up for discussion, another key component that Paul brought up in his presentation was the issue around engagement and the focus on the process of resilience assessment. And this is also critical, and we've done some work together on identifying who to engage and when to engage them at different points in the process, and putting the time and effort in before you embark on a resilience assessment to identify key stakeholder groups and understand when their engagement would be most valuable to the process to make the most of the process, and also for there to be ownership around the resilience assessment to better ensure that the interventions and planning that happens after the assessment will continue and will be successful. So those are the three highlights that I think I'd like to focus on from Paul's presentation as a summary, and I think I'll pass it over to you, Marcela, and open it up to questions.
Many thanks, Alison. This is a really interesting and relevant topic for our NBSAP Forum members. I would like to invite participants to share your questions, doubts, and comments, or raise your hand to participate in the Q&A session. Please use the control panel of GoToWebinar platform. We can open your microphone or read your question depending on your preference. Do we have any? Let me see. Is anybody raising their hands? We love to have people ask their questions openly via the microphone. Let me check if we have any hands raised. Nope. Well, let's see. I have a couple of questions that can help maybe jumpstart the conversation here, Allison. You've highlighted a few key concepts that are really important from Paul's presentation. And I was wondering, because one thing he emphasizes is the importance of engagement, particularly in terms of including the gender approach. In your experience, for example, is it difficult to include the gender approach? Does it vary greatly between different communities? How do you address gender issues during our resilience assessment?
It's an excellent question, Marcela, and to be fair, I think that some of the approaches that are out there and publicly available online, etc., haven't fully engaged with the issue of gender and how to include it in a resilience assessment approach in particular. And it's definitely a knowledge gap area that Paul and I are actively addressing in the revised approach that we're working on right now with the Stockholm Resilience Center. And in that area, we're working with a gender expert to help us identify how we can better integrate issues of gender in the engagement process. I will say from my own experience that it's definitely a challenge, and it also speaks to the importance of context, and this is always one of the important things that comes up when you're embarking on a resilience assessment, really understanding the context of a particular place and the people involved, and working with your partners to identify how the process can be adapted to be most suitable for that particular context. And so when I worked in Tajikistan, we collaborated with a particular development agency that was active in the rural villages, and they worked with us to change and adjust the way in which the workshops would be held, where things like where meetings would take place, and different approaches to doing some of the work that we had to do. So for example, rather than meeting in some of the central meeting areas, we would take a village walk, and this is made it more comfortable for many of the women who were participating to talk more freely one-on-one as we walked through the village, rather than in a large group in a formal center. So that's just one example, and I know that there are many ways in which gender can be better integrated into any type of participatory process, and of course we're drawing on that as well, and specifically in terms of resilience assessment.
Thank you so much, Allison. We have a question from Francisco Cobos. He asks, how can you engage as an external actor in local situations if the governmental structures are part of the problem?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think it also speaks to the idea of partnerships and having someone within the local context in which you're working who has those contacts and connections and ability to work with you. And yes, sometimes other governments, for example, can be part of the problem, and I think that is something that you build into your engagement approach in terms of the sequencing and timing of when you might engage those stakeholders and actors in your process, or not engage them, depending on what your objectives for the resilience assessment are. I know I have been involved with some before where we work more with the local grassroots group and develop the assessment to the point where our interventions and planning that we develop might involve opening a dialogue with government agencies further down the road. But all of that needs to come out of the assessment in terms of timing and when to do and when to engage other actors that are important in the system.
Thank you, Alison. We have somebody raising their hand, Mark Calamia. I will open the microphone. Please be as direct and straightforward as possible so that we can all have enough time for Alison to answer everybody's questions. So I'll open the microphone now. Hi, Mark. Mark? Can you hear us? Hello, Mark? I think we have a problem, but we have someone else. Asir Udin. Asir, good morning. Can you hear us?
Yeah, good morning.
Good morning. You can go ahead and ask your question to Alison. Hello?
What's the approach of hello?
Hello? Yes, we can hear you. Okay. It seems we're having technology issues. Well, we have, in the meantime, we have some other questions that have come in. Clara Boquino asks, is there evidence of how does resilience assessment learn from disaster risk reduction?
That's a great question as well. I was actually recently at a meeting with people involved in disaster risk reduction, and obviously there are some important relationships, but in terms of the learning between them, I think that's happening. The International Risk Governance Council has been involved in developing guidelines for how resilience can inform disaster risk reduction. And I think similarly, the social-ecological resilience community is learning from other disciplinary perspectives and entry points into this whole area of resilience and applying a complexity lens to issues like disaster. As many of you will know, a lot of the ecological resilience literature comes out of understanding dynamics in ecosystems, and often those ecosystem dynamics will involve things such as flooding and fires, which translate into disaster situations on another level, depending on how the system has been managed and the particular vulnerabilities that exist, again, coming down to context. So I would say that this is an active area of learning and research, and with mutually beneficial opportunities for learning from these different communities.
Thank you, Alison. We have a question from a person called Alison Acosta. She asks, would you consider involving key actors throughout the process too complicated rather than engaging certain people groups at key moments?
Thanks, Alison, for your question. I think it can be too complicated sometimes, and other times not. And I don't want to kind of overemphasize the importance of context, but I have been involved in both types of assessment approaches where, yes, the key actors have been in from the very start, and sometimes that's really critical. And it depends in part on their level of engagement and capacity and their role in decision making in the system. And sometimes it's much more beneficial for everyone involved to engage groups of actors at different points in the process, in part not to take too much time from some people, but also depending on the expertise and level of interest of different groups. And so again, that's one of those aspects in preparing for the assessment that needs to be considered in detail.
Excellent. Thank you so much. We have Charlotte Moser asks, are there templates available for resilience assessments?
There are. There was a guidebook published in 2007 initially, and then 2010 from the Resilience Alliance that includes, it's actually called a workbook for practitioners, and that includes worksheets and sets of questions and a full guidance on how to conduct a resilience assessment. There are numerous other resilience assessment approaches available. I have at least a dozen in one of my folders, and again, depending on the objectives of the resilience assessment, and you might choose one approach over another. Another recent guidebook is called RAPTA that integrates, and this comes out of CSIRO, and I know Paul Ryan was involved in this project as well, and it integrates more a stronger component on building adaptive and transformative capacity, which is actually a critical component to building resilience. And that updated guidebook does an excellent job at integrating aspects of adaptation and transformation into the process of resilience assessment. All of this is available online.
Excellent. Thank you so much. We have Juice Bax asking how to determine the scale and boundaries of the system and topic of research.
Yeah, so the topic usually relates to the issues or problems or challenges, however you want to frame them. Often there's more than one, and usually they help determine the approximate boundaries. And I like to think in terms of fuzzy boundaries, and I know Paul addressed this in his presentation as well, that you have to understand that usually you don't get it right the first time, and these are fuzzy boundaries, and as the process continues they can be adjusted depending on as your understanding of system dynamics deepens, that it may be important to bump those boundaries out a little bit or focus a little bit more on a smaller area. And so, and then the scale above and below, again, these usually are a little bit revealed by, again, the issues that you're dealing with and what are some of those external drivers that are really influencing the system that you're interested in. And below that, what's the sort of scale at which groups of stakeholders or actors or ecosystem processes are having an influence on the system in a relevant way that sort of helps you to identify what that scale is. So there's no sort of hard and fast rules on how you go about identifying those scales and boundaries. It does tend to emerge a little bit through discussion and dialogue and understanding a little bit more about the system and the purpose of the assessment, the objectives, and why you're doing the assessment.
Great, thank you, Alison. We have somebody raising his hand, Danan Gora. Hi, Danan, how are you?
Hello, good morning and good evening from my vacation.
Go ahead, you can ask Alison your question.
Okay, so my question is, during doing assessment in some poor neighborhood or poor countries, so I would like to know what are some of the difficulties that like Alison have during doing the assessment on resilience. Because as you know, in the poor places, like people will be trying to provide their daily needs from like planting or fishing or those, but when you come and you tell them to do it in resilience way, they will be maybe they won't be able to provide as much as they need because they are poor. So I would like to know some of the difficulties that
That's a great question.
Yeah.
Thank you for that question. That's really important, and I think it speaks to, again, the preparation phase before you even embark on a resilience assessment. Why are you there? Have you been invited? And in all of the cases that I've been involved with, it's because I've been asked to come and offer some workshops and work with agencies, usually, who are already active in the communities in developing countries. And so, and again, my expertise specifically in working in developing countries is not very long and extensive. I've done a lot more work over in North America and Europe than I have in a developing country context. But when I have been involved, it's been to work with agencies who are already active in the community and are very aware of the daily needs and timing of when workshops are to happen and when they should not happen, and how they should happen, to specifically not interfere with schedules already, obviously not during times of harvest and things like that. And then I guess the only other thing I would say is one of the adjustment is knowing your audience. And so depending on who's involved in the actual workshop setting and process, translating some of what can be relatively abstract issues that we deal with in a resilience assessment, translating them into ways of talking about change and adapting to change and building capacities to cope with change, rather than more, I guess, abstract things like cross-scale interactions. I hope that helps.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, great. We have somebody else raising their hand, James Gaconda. I'm going to open your microphone. Hello, James. James, can you hear us? Hello? It seems we're having connection issues. In the meantime, we have another question from Francisco. He says, for example, you can receive a request from local NGOs to support, but do not receive the approval from the government because they benefit from the current situation.
Yeah, that definitely can happen, and I think I guess my reply to that would be, if the local NGOs are willing to engage at some point, then a lot can still be accomplished at a local level in working with NGOs. And yes, the government agencies can be part of the problem, and you can obviously only do so much with a resilience assessment, but what you can do is advance understanding of some of the issues and really understanding the sort of multifaceted aspects of resilience. And so here we might bring into the workshop or dialogue issues around principles of resilience and how they can be isolated and how they're relevant to that particular system, and what types of, not necessarily interventions, but planning can go into enhancing some of those capacities, so that at some point there, further into the future, there may be an opportunity to have a, we might consider it a window of opportunity where there's some change in the governance of the situation that allows new options and opportunities to be followed up on. So I guess I would say that yes, that's always important to be aware of the broader context and the role of governance and government systems, and even issues like corruption. And it doesn't mean that the resilience assessment is not worth doing at that point in time.
Thank you so much, Allison. We have somebody else raising their hand. We're going to see if we can make this work. Daniel Catebalila, I will open your microphone now. Hello, Daniel. Can you hear us?
Yes, I can just hear you.
Okay.
Hello? Hello?
Hello, yes.
Thank you for the good presentation. And I was thinking to see that when considering the gender dynamics in the resilience assessment, it's obvious that it's very critical to programming of kind of gender-sensitive, gender-focused resilience approaches. But the problem that maybe is arising is how to integrate accountability of duty bearers to those gender-sensitive issues that are pertaining there around, mostly in the cultural dynamics that is more patriarch systems. They are just the society is being led by men, not women. The women undermined. So, looking at these old dynamics, how do we ensure the accountability of these kind of duty bearers to ensure that all gender issues are being incorporated within the assessment?
Thanks, Daniel. I would say I'm personally not a gender expert, and I would draw heavily on others around me who have that expertise to inform a process. But I do know that it is a critical issue, and there's a real need for that gender sensitivity, and that yes, in many of these development contexts, there are these cultural components and patriarchal systems that play into the whole process. And there has been a lot done in other approaches in development that have methods and tools and ways of working with that to the degree that they can. And I would say that we can, resilience assessment can't solve those problems. We can, when we embark on a resilience assessment, be aware of them and, to the best of our abilities, draw on current understanding of best practices for engaging with communities and people where those cultural contexts are present.
Thank you, Alison. We have another question from Hania from Brazil. She asks, what are the main points to consider to balance technical environmental information with social and human rights information? Do you have a practical example?
Practical example, that's great. This is a very good question, and the particular balance that you achieve between those technical components, I will say, when resilience assessment initially was being conceived, and really, again, this goes back to the early in the 2000s, and drawing on research that emerged from case studies that really understood more of the technical components of what conferred resilience on a system, and looking for things like thresholds in a system and alternate states in a system. And so, yes, there's definitely this technical component to a resilience assessment, but equally important, because resilience assessment is very much a learning process. So equally important is the understanding and learning that develops through the process, but also understanding in that integrated social ecological system context the ways in which governance of the ecosystem interacts. And so let me see a particular example. I mean, I've been involved in coastal fisheries governance resilience assessment, and there I think there's both a need in that particular case, because it was working on the central coast of British Columbia in Canada with Heiltsuk First Nations. There was a cultural component as well, working with an Indigenous community and needing to integrate traditional knowledge as well as scientific knowledge on the fisheries, and also to integrate different forms of and different governance authorities, so both the Indigenous resource management agencies as well as the provincial and federal agencies. And again, it's specific to each case, but the developing this conceptual model of how those different components influence one another and what some of the feedbacks are between them, and developing that sort of deep understanding of those interactions will itself sort of help you to find that right balance. And that also gets back to Paul's point in the presentation of the iterative learning process of resilience assessment. It's very difficult to get it right the first time because you're continually learning and refining some of the models and refining your understanding, testing your assumptions, and gathering, new evidence, or synthesizing existing evidence to really just deepen that understanding as you move forward. And the balance between the technical component and the I think you called it the social component, which could be governance systems or the process itself of engaging stakeholders in the assessment. That's something that is context specific and that you work through as you follow through on the process.
Excellent. Thank you so much. We have an interesting question posed by Alexandra Palmquist. She asked, can you highlight a bit the differences between resilience assessment and vulnerability assessment?
Thanks, Alexandra. I have a lot of experience with resilience assessment and not very much with vulnerability assessment, but I would say my understanding is that vulnerability assessment, there's the idea of risk and exposure to that risk, and in my mind, one of the important differences with resilience assessment is resilience assessment is looking at a system before anything really happens necessarily or goes wrong, whereas vulnerability assessment, there's known risks, and often that risk has happened. And so with resilience assessment, there's a stronger focus on understanding, really from this, using this complexity lens to understand the dynamics in the system, and that how you can build capacities so that the system is able to cope with shocks and stresses to the system. And I think with vulnerability, there's more of an emphasis on those sources of vulnerability within communities, usually, that make the risk greater if the community is exposed to some perturbation in the system. So that's not, you'll find much better comparisons in the literature where people have had time to kind of think them through and know them both well, and more systematically compare them. But that's sort of my own sense of some of the differences between resilience assessment and vulnerability assessment.
Thank you, Allison. We have lots of questions. People are very active today, and that's great. Is there a sort of manual for resilience assessment? Yes, you already answered that. There are several guidelines, and they're available online. Perhaps Allison will share with us some of those resources later on. Here's an interesting question. In Nepal, Noor Jung Shah asks, in Nepal there are a diversity of people and also cultural taboos. So how do we build the resilience of vulnerable people along with cultural taboos? So I guess it's when there's local resistance probably to some of this resilience assessment process due to cultural beliefs. Or have you encountered anything like that in your experience?
Well, I haven't personally, but I think that there are most often, I think it's absolutely common for there to be a diversity of people in almost every assessment I've done, because when we come back to the reason for doing a resilience assessment, often it's because there's some issue or problem that relates to some imbalance or trade-offs in ecosystem services. The trade-offs between the different ways different groups are benefiting from the current arrangement and the goods and services provided. And so the idea of diversity of people, groups, stakeholders, etc., and organizations, that's actually something that exists, I think, in almost any resilience assessment, any complex adaptive system. And you know, again, there are ways to interact with that diversity and to benefit from it, actually, in terms of, you know, having the benefit of a multiple evidence base and being able to integrate, again, this is a learning approach, so integrating different knowledge systems to deepen understanding. In terms of cultural taboos, I mean, I haven't personally been involved in an assessment in which that was a variable or an important component. But I can imagine that, you know, in some cases, some cultural taboos like sacred forests and not harvesting in sacred forests or something like that can actually benefit the system and play a positive role in terms of, again, you know, enhancing diversity. In that case, ecological diversity, perhaps contributing to, in other ways, to the resilience of a system. So I can't provide a specific example that I've been involved in that works with cultural taboos, but I have been involved in assessments where there is a real need to draw on multiple knowledge systems and to really open the space for a dialogue so that those different worldviews and types of knowledge can be can be heard and represented at the table, and that they can enhance and contribute to the knowledge base, and that goes into, again, understanding how the system works so that you can make decisions and sort of play a role in influencing how that system is going to change and how capacity can be built within it.
Excellent. Thank you so much. We have two questions that are somehow related because they deal with including resilience thinking in two different types of stakeholders. We have one participant asking, how do we promote resilience thinking in development projects? And another one asking, what is the role of small-scale farmers to resilience, or in resilience? So I know they are very different, but in the end, they are two types of stakeholders that must sometimes meet during a resilience assessment. So if you could maybe address those two questions.
Sure. Thanks for the question. Promoting resilience thinking in development projects. That's interesting. That's actually a real growth area right now. My understanding, a lot of the large international development agencies, through programs like the Global Resilience Project that Rockefeller Foundation's involved in USAID, and the Swedish International Development Agency, there is a lot of work from people involved in that project and others around promoting resilience thinking in development projects. And I know that there's a number of resources available online that offer tools and methods for integrating resilience thinking. Mangroves for the Future in Southeast Asia has done a lot of work to sort of translate the workbook for practitioners, the resilience assessment workbook for practitioners, into a resilience analysis protocol that would specifically work with coastal mangrove farmers. And, you know, again, tailoring the approach a little bit to a specific context. that agency uses that process to be able to identify or help, I guess, evaluate which projects to invest time and resources into. And so there's quite a bit that can be done, and anytime, I guess, promoting an idea comes into that brings to my mind just the real need to open the dialogue and collaborate and kind of move forward in a way of collaboration and co-producing some of the knowledge that goes into how we can better integrate resilience thinking and really using that complex lens to how you approach a problem in development projects. And then the second part of that question was around small-scale farmers in resilience. So that's an actor group, that's a stakeholder group, I guess, that would be involved in a lot of resilience assessment processes. And I guess I'm not really quite sure how to expand on that other than to say that, depending on the system that you're focusing on, that could be, and the issues that you're that the assessment is addressing, that is often a stakeholder group that has sort of direct interaction with the ecosystem, and has played a role in many of the assessments that I know Paul has done in rural Australia, and some of them that I've been involved in. And I consider it to be an actor group, just like fishermen or others. Yeah, I'll leave it there for now.
Excellent, thank you. We'll try to open the microphone again with Mark Alamia. Let's see. Mark, are you there? Can you hear us? Hello, Mark? Okay, we're having issues with his microphone, but I'm going to ask you his question. He wants to know, how exactly does climate change figure in the resilience assessment in the Tier 3 scale model that was presented in the slide? Can you clarify that for him?
Sure. I'm also looking for the slide. I think this is it. Is my screen shared? Hello?
Yes, it's shared. There it is.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah, so I think, and this is actually often the case, that climate change, climate variability is one of those drivers that impacts most systems, most focal scale systems. So in this slide that Paul has, I interpret it that the protected area in the middle is perhaps the focal system that the resilience assessment is directed at, and that a larger scale system of the land or seascape, there would be drivers such as perhaps population, demographics, social attitudes, values, and climate change that would be influencing, kind of at a macro level scale, influencing that protected area. And it's often the case, I know in the herring fishery example that I provided earlier, the influence of climate change on warming temperatures off the coast, the central coast of Canada, are having an effect on the fisheries in that area. And so in that sense, climate change is an external driver on the system. In other areas, it may be the role of climate change in drought cycles, or even in flooding, and the change in the frequency and magnitude of some of those natural disturbance events. And so it's what we're coping with now, and I would say almost 90% of the time, if not 100% of the time, climate change is an external driver on most of the systems that we're working with in the context of resilience assessment.
Thank you, Alison. We have Abdi Fatah Ahmed asking to raising his hand to ask a question. No, doesn't seem to be working. Well, but his question is about Somalia. He says, in Somalia, people are too vulnerable to drought. What can we say that these people are missing? I'm not really sure what exactly you're aiming at, Abdi Fattah, but can you cover something or explain how drought and vulnerability have been addressed in resilience assessments in your experience, for example, or in other experiences that you know of?
Yeah. So again, this follows from Mark's question around climate change and resilience assessment, and often climate change is playing an external influencing role on drought. And there's also been a lot of work in the area of they've been called traps, different types of traps that you can get into when capacity continues to be degraded in a system. And drought is one of those factors that can kind of create this feedback loop and sort of vicious cycle that, you know, makes it that much more difficult to find ways of addressing those issues. And again, that also speaks to the idea of the sort of scaled, nested structure of these systems, and where the people who might be involved in a resilience assessment can only have so much influence at certain levels. But in the case of, you know, drought vulnerability in Somalia, I mean, that's a huge issue, obviously. And in terms of taking a resilience assessment approach or lens to that type of problem, we might start with saying, okay, well, who can we work with that has some role in or opportunity to influence policymaking and decision making, or even at a community level, what sorts of adaptive strategies might be something that we can consider following a more in-depth look at the system dynamics that are specific to a particular community or region in that's affected by drought. You know, sometimes it might relate to grazing systems and vegetation cover and even land tenure. And so there can be a whole bunch of different factors that can be you know, maintaining a system, maintaining the vulnerability of a system to issues like drought. And by understanding some of those relationships in a little bit more in this sort of complex systems way, we might be able to more closely look at ways to disrupt some of those feedbacks and to intervene at particular locations where there are opportunities to sort of leverage change and redirect the system. But obviously, you know, a resilience assessment wouldn't solve the problem of vulnerability to drought, but it might enable the people that we're working with to come up with strategies, to develop strategies that are built upon an understanding of what's making that system more vulnerable and communities and people more vulnerable to drought.
Thank you so much. I'm going to open the microphone for Karen McDonald now. Hello, Karen, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning.
Please go ahead and ask your question.
My question had to do with how much the resilience assessments consider catastrophe, a full destruction. And I'm from the Caribbean, and it really had to do with trying to do conservation, etc., in a climate where we do have regular hurricanes and earthquakes. So does the assessment consider that level of destruction, and how can we consider it in what we're doing?
Yeah, thanks, Karen. There's always a sort of balance that needs to be struck in terms of, you know, and actually a lot of complementary relationships between conservation in the sense of, in a Caribbean context, perhaps, you know, looking at how coastal systems are being managed, and forest cover, and even infrastructure, and how decisions made around those sorts of parts of the system can influence the sort of degree to which a storm event becomes a catastrophe, as opposed to a, you know, a hurricane that that doesn't have such a catastrophic effect. And so resilience assessment, I mean, because resilience assessment came out of this understanding of ecological theory, that many disturbance events they follow cycles. Some of you may be familiar with the concept of the adaptive cycle, and how we manage systems can make them more vulnerable to these events like hurricanes. And again, this speaks to the idea of investing in sort of resilient, ready, I guess, infrastructure, and how coastal systems may be hard, the degree to which development might harden those coasts versus enabling more of a buffering capacity by maintaining natural systems along the coast, and also things like social networks and connectivity in the system, and how warning systems can build resilience to events like that and enable more rapid recovery, both in terms of, you know, warning and also knowledge, and how resources can be shared before, during, and after events. And so I think there's many opportunities to take a resilience lens and look at hurricanes and other types of, you know, large storm events that can have these really massive catastrophic consequences.
Thank you so much, Alison. We have a very interesting question about ethics. The question is exactly, is there a universal ethical code already in place, or should it be developed through the process?
I mean, I guess the question is asking if there's a universal ethical code in place in terms of resilience assessment. Just to,
I guess, yes.
Yeah, just to keep that focus a little bit sharper. And I would say, well, no, in the sense of there being anything universal, but there's most definitely an understanding of the importance of ethics in resilience assessment, especially in a development context, in all cases really, but I think particularly where the outcomes and influence and can be so much more direct with people and in terms of their well-being and livelihood. And so there is not a universal ethics code, but definitely in the Wayfinder approach that I'm developing right now with Paul Ryan and others at the Stockholm Resilience Center, the role of ethics in engaging with communities and engaging with stakeholders and in a learning process that involves resilience assessment is definitely something that we're taking very seriously and trying to integrate into our guidelines for preparing for the assessment and following through on the process right through to the implementation phase.
Thank you so much. Now we have two related questions. One's from Rocio. She asks, what do you think is the main outcome of a resilience assessment? And on the other hand, Lucia Cortez asks, what is the priority and its criteria to implement resilience? Preserve biodiversity, avoid environmental disasters, or empower the people to be proactive using the resources from biodiversity?
Okay, So first, with Rosario's question, what is the main outcome of a resilience assessment? I mean, they're all different, obviously, but and so outcomes and outputs are going to vary depending on the objectives of the assessment. But in a very general sense, I would say that resilience assessment always has been really about deepening your understanding of system dynamics. And so really trying to synthesize and integrate different components into having this sort of whole systems picture of what is happening, which is it's actually a big departure from how things have been done in many places for a long time, which is to look at issues in a very sort of narrowly defined way, often as a purely technical problem in ecosystem management or natural resource management, or in other ways in other domains. But really, the main outcome of a social ecological resilience assessment is developing that understanding of how the system works and how that complexity and focusing on relationships within the system rather than individual components or parts of the system, rather understanding how there can be unintended consequences when you intervene and change part of the system for one outcome or to deliver a set of benefits to a particular group of people without considering how that can affect the whole system. And yeah, so that's, I guess, the main outcome. And then in terms of prioritizing the purpose, I guess, or objectives of a resilience assessment, be it biodiversity preservation or empowering people, I can't remember the third point. I think that's one of the beauties of taking a complex adaptive systems approach to understanding systems, is that it's not one or the other, and often many of these things are complementary and not necessarily preserving biodiversity, but understanding how diversity might play a role in the system and how that can create benefits that are of value to people and that deliver, allow a system to sort of contribute to people's well-being, while at the same time empowering people to be more involved or in how that system develops and evolves over time, can be complementary. So I don't think I think resilience assessment moves us away from a traditional kind of framing of conservation versus human development or something like that, and toward, well, how can we consider together the whole system and objectives of the variety and diversity of stakeholders in the system. And I'm not saying that it can do everything, but it does grapple with what those trade-offs are and understand how that works within the context of the whole system dynamics.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Well, we have several questions also here. We have a person asking about how to apply resilience principles to encourage learning and broadening participation to wildfire calamities in southeastern United States in the sectors of biodiversity, renewable energy, and sustainable built environment. How will we remedy the sequestered carbon in the forest? What will be the resilience approach in forest carbon sequestration? Is there anything specific about forest carbon sequestration linked to resilience?
Well, I mean, not specifically, but I guess I would say this is an issue which a resilience assessment could engage with to understand, again, well, what are the issues here? It's balancing and managing wildfire while at the same time considering the benefit that an ecosystem service essentially that forests provide of sequestering and storing carbon and locking it into that forest system. There's, I think in the southern United States, there's a lot of work being done around learning networks and wildfire, and a lot has happened recently, obviously, and over the past couple of decades in terms of learning and education around the role that wildfires play in ecosystems and how managing fire within a system can reduce the potential for catastrophic fire by enabling prescribed fires or allowing some fires to burn. And again, there's a whole science around fire management, but we've definitely moved away from the idea that fires to be prevented at all costs, because obviously some forests require fire to maintain them. And yet, so there's this whole element, I guess I would say, of a sort of scientific ecological understanding of the role that fire plays in forest systems, and this depends. It's context specific. It depends on the type of forest, but resilience would definitely bring to that. Excuse me. The role of fire in the system as a natural process and how that can be governed and managed. Sorry, I've got something in my throat, so I'm just going to take a minute.
That's okay, Alison. Thank you so much. Let's see if we have anybody else raising their hands. Asir Udin, hello, can you hear us now?
Yeah, thank you for nice presentation and give me the chance. I think lots of ecological or development challenges faced by Bangladesh, like education, awareness, climate sensitivity, political biasness, and now we are faced more than 100,000, 100 million Rohingyas penetration in Bangladesh. My questions for our friends, what's the innovative and sustainable solution for our countries?
Thank you, Asir. These are honestly really challenging questions because there's a huge number of really challenging and complex issues in interplay in these sorts of situations. Obviously, with the mass immigration of the Rohingyas and others, and political challenges interacting with climate variables and other both social and ecological driving forces and influences on the system. And so I would happily open this up for some dialogue and discussion within this group right now in terms of what are some innovative and sustainable solutions. I think that my answer would be that it would be difficult to sort of come up with these off the top of our head, or else somebody else would have already done that. And I think it's through processes that really involve learning, involve collaboration, involve bringing together different worldviews and perspectives, as well as scientific understanding of some of the sort of political elements and other aspects of the system. Bringing that together is part of the process of learning our way forward and developing understanding so that we can come up with ideas, innovative ideas, and strategies, because there are no simple solutions to what are really very complex problems.
Thank you so much. Allison. We have somebody else raising their hand. Antonio Quilice. Antonio, you're there?
Yes. Hello. Hello.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning. Yes. My question is, can you provide an example or give an example of ecosystem resilience, conservation, and enhancement concept for policymakers in the world, or links for that experience or experiences?
Sure. An example of ecosystem resilience?
An example of ecosystem resilience, conservation, and enhancement concept for policymakers. I live in a country who has, in a tropical country, which have policy making, environmental policy making problems. And I would like to, if you can provide an example of how can be applied this concept of concepts of resilience, conservation, and enhancement for policymakers in the world. This can be answered by a link or links to the specific experiences.
Okay, thanks, Anthony. I think that, okay, a particular example, there's probably many out there. Some of the ones that I'm aware of and that I have personally been involved with, and I'm not sure if you're looking for like a concrete example of where policy has actually been an outcome of a resilience assessment. Policy change has been an outcome of resilience assessment process. I know that policy levers, identifying what those are so that you can influence policy has definitely been an outcome of resilience approaches to dealing with conservation. For example, on the Great Barrier Reef in Australia, there have been a number of people who have taken a complex systems approach and a resilience approach really to understanding how the Great Barrier Reef is managed, how the balance between conservation efforts and use of the reef for fisheries and tourism and can be managed in the context also of, again, climate change and runoff and pollutants into the water. And in terms of enhancing rules and policy, one of the outcomes from that process really identified how to move toward more adaptive forms of governance and how to engage policy at multiple levels. And that was one of the sort of key lessons learned, that often when there needs to be changes within a system through policy, then that needs to happen at sort of local, regional, and even, perhaps national levels. And that those rules, if they change only at one level alone, may not have the desired impact that they could have if action is taken again at multiple levels. And so there's the example of how governance systems have been considered through resilience approach in Australia, and also with the fisheries example that I provided earlier on the central coast of British Columbia. Their specific policies weren't looked at so much as how to move toward more collaborative forms of governance, how to consider sharing of authority in decisions around fishery quotas and that sort of approach. And again, the context is really important in that case and in others, because there has to be a degree of receptivity to moving toward more collaborative forms of governance that may not exist and doesn't exist everywhere. But when there is that opportunity to try to move toward those sort of more collaborative forms of decision making and eventually policy setting. Okay, so those are two examples, I guess, that I'm aware of, but I don't have on the top of my head right now a tropical conservation project in mind. I'm sorry that I just don't have one right now to draw on.
That's great, Allison. We really appreciate everything that you're sharing with us. We have two questions that are related. We have Mohammed Hamad asking about the similarities between resilience and adaptation capacity, and Ian Morrison asking about environmental impact assessments and strategic environmental assessments are elaborate investigations to identify significant impacts of policies, programs, plans, and projects. Where and how does resilience assessment fit into this? So those two questions are linked, and we would like, I don't know, if you could share your views on that with participants, that would be great.
Sure. Okay, so starting off, I guess the relationship between building resilience capacity and building adaptive capacity. This really comes back to the definition of what resilience is, and in the definition that I draw on incorporates adaptive capacity and transformative capacity into resilience. And so I guess how I can kind of think about this is that, the resilience of a particular system, a place with people involved and interacting, there are some parts of that system that you want to persist, to stay the same, that there's some, suite of ecosystem services and benefits to people that are valued, and you may want parts of that to persist. But in order for those components to persist, it requires that the system constantly adapt and come up with ways to respond and cope with some of those stresses and shocks to the system that change themselves and evolve over time. And this comes back to the whole notion of complex adaptive systems exhibit emergent behavior. And so there's the self-organizing capacity, and again, that's sort of like an built-in evolutionary capacity. And so for systems or communities, places to be able to persist and maintain those sort of services and values and benefits to people that are valued, there's always going to be a need for adaptation. And so again, enhancing that adaptive capacity, which is really more in the realm of people's capacity to come up with adaptive strategies and mechanisms. And then also folded into that is this notion of scales in complex systems, and how, again, for resilience for a system to maintain resilience over time, it may be necessary for transformation, more fundamental change to happen at another scale within the system. So that's sort of my interpretation of how resilience and adaptive capacity and transformative capacity really interact. They're sort of on a continuum, and they're very much related, adaptive capacity being more in the realm of the sort of human responses within the system and to its ability to adapt. The second part of the question dealt with strategic environmental assessments and the impact specifically of policy plans, programs, et cetera, and how resilience assessment relates to strategic environmental assessments. I don't have a lot of experience with these types of environmental assessments. My understanding is they can involve sort of a very technical component that would be a valuable source of technical expertise and knowledge that could inform a resilience assessment. I think part of the one of the important differences in my mind is that a resilience assessment is very much a participatory learning process. And so while a strategic environmental assessment might be something that some consultants can do on a desktop, for example, and draw it on resources and evidence, the sort of evidence that's out there in the literature and in reports, etc., and compile that to be able to say something about the impacts of a project, a particular project might have. A resilience assessment is designed to be more of a participatory learning process that would engage a broader diversity of stakeholders and use that learning and understanding to develop strategies. And it really is not something that you do a resilience assessment and you're done and you don't need to revisit it. The idea is really of a resilience assessment is really changing your perspective on how you understand that system work, and developing some hypotheses or assumptions and ideas around how things work, and then testing them over time, and then continually revising your understanding of the system to be able to continue to direct it along a more sustainable trajectory, as opposed to doing an assessment at one point in time, coming up with some solutions, and then the problem solved. Because I believe Paul also mentioned this in his talk, a problem may be addressed, but there will always be more in the future because these are complex systems that are continually evolving. And so there's always a need to understand these emerging issues in that context of system dynamics.
Thank you so much. You have you have been great. We're really grateful for all the experiences that you've shared and your knowledge. And we have one last question from one of our participants. Pavan Sabithi wants to know if you can share one successful example of resilience assessment from Tajikistan, from your own experience.
Sure, thanks, Pavan. The work that I did in Tajikistan, it was really interesting. It was a long time ago. It was in 2007 and then again in 2008 on 2 separate visits, along with Christopher Bricious, a colleague of mine, and working with the MSDSP, Mountain Societies Development Support Program. And so again, collaborating with that agency to go into a couple of rural villages and hold workshops to better understand that the issues that we were dealing with at that point were water management, rural water management, and it involved a lot of capacity building, and that was part of the understanding for us working there, was that we were there to develop some capacity both at village level but also at the agency level. And so we had held workshops in the communities and also with agency staff in Dushanbe. And one of the outcomes that I consider to be a success from that process and the reports that came out of it was that the MSDSP rewrote this sort of template for how villages were to develop their village management plans. And so that was informed by the what came out of that resilience assessment and some of the insights that emerged in terms of networks, using social networks and drawing on that understanding to enable better access to resources. And so the village management plan template was changed, and this had more of a broad impact because that influenced then how these plans were evaluated for future projects within the agency. And so I think that was that was one case where the assessment worked at 2 levels, the village level and also at the broader level of the agencies themselves that we're going to be continuing to work with these communities into the future.
Excellent. That's really exciting. We have reached our allotted time. So many thanks again, Allison, for your time and your willingness to answer so many interesting questions that our participants posed today. Allison, I don't know if you want to share some final remarks on the topic or a brief summary or an explanation that you think still is needed, or any recommendations you may have for our participants today.
Thanks, Marcela. I really enjoyed this, and the questions were excellent. Some of them very challenging, and they really speak to the fact that in many places all around the world, we are dealing with some very complex issues. And so again, I think what I would like to emphasize is that resilience assessment is not a recipe. It's not the solution to all of the problems, but it's really a process that when you enter into it, if you structure your process in such a way, you can really enhance learning and bring people together to co-create a shared understanding of the system in a way that can inform the strategies that you want to develop to best reflect back on the system and help build that capacity, help build that resilience in the system. And so again, it's an investment, it's a process, and it requires a lot of inputs and collaboration and resourcing.
Excellent, thank you so much. Well, to our participants, I want to thank you as well, and I want to remind you that you can check out our website, www.nbsapforum.net, to receive the latest news regarding this webinar and the Introduction to Resilience for Development MOOC. There you will also find a PDF copy of Paul's presentation and a link to the recording of this session with Allison, which will be available on our YouTube channel. Stay tuned for our next sessions. For further information, please visit the NBSAP Forum or follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Also, please remember to register or update your profile and to finish the weekly lessons, which are required to obtain a certificate for this course. So if you haven't finished lesson 1 yet, please do so as soon as possible. The NBSAP Forum is a global partnership to support the development and implementation of effective national biodiversity strategies and action plans. It is hosted by the Secretariat of Convention on Biological Diversity, the United Nations Development Program, and the United Nations Environment Program. I'm Marcela Torres, and on behalf of the NBSAP Forum, I hope you all enjoyed this session. Have a great day or evening. See you next week.